So we are basically in chapter 12 and 13, but don't read the whole shebang yet, because the Phillips curve and the AIS curve is already a little bit talked about in chapter 12, and we don't do that yet at all. Not yet at all. We do that after the break, the Phillips curve and the AIS curve. What we want to stick with is the so-called IS curve, which we already done, and we add to it today the MP curve and the AD curve. And also, if you read in the book doesn't have the multiplier that we have in our IS curve all the time. So I think in chapter 12 and 13, they just set x equal to 0 to make things a little bit nicer and easier. But since we've done the multiplier already before the mid-semester exam, and because it fits nicely with all the other stuff, it's always here on the slides. But don't get shocked that it looks different to the book. The only difference is we have the multiplier, they set the multiplier x equals 0, the basically multiplier of 1. Where are we? So we had the standard GDP thing here, and that was our goods market equilibrium, where we said everything that is being produced is being either consumed, invested, the government is eating it up, or we send it overseas, minus the imports. The endogenous variables that we had up to now were GDP itself, right? That was one of the variables that we want to explain. Consumption, because we made consumption a function of GDP, remember? If you get higher income, we start consuming more. That makes consumption an endogenous variable. And investment was endogenous because it was driven by the interest rate up. Just because it's a while ago, so if the interest rates go up, investment goes down, right? Because less projects are breaking even. Exogenous variables, so that's variables that we just plugged in. We said this is a certain number, we take it from outside. Were in the past R and all kinds of shocks which were hidden in the variable A. And today the new thing that we want to do is we basically want to endogenize the interest rate. So in the next few weeks, more and more of these variables will be endogenized. Today it's R. After the break it will be inflation. And then we go to the BP curve, then it will be foreign exchange in imports. So we get the model bigger and bigger and bigger to explain more and more variables. So we have the money market equilibrium today. We talk about monetary policy, central banks, and inflation, and the result will be we endogenize R. Money supply and demand. Let me see what we have here. It's a little bit easier if I go straight to the graph. I think it's a bit more interesting. So we want to make a graph where we have the money market, and in the money market we have certain demand for money and supply for money. For that one, I think it's useful already to ask you, do you have finance classes already? Did you talk about central banks, reserves, interest? Well, you would have bond rates, I imagine, in the finance class. But you did something monetary policy as well? Oh, okay, good. So, let me see what we've got here. Let's go straight to the graph, that's a little bit easier. So this is the money market. We plonk on here the nominal interest rate for the time being. And here is money. Now what is money? Money can be either the cash in our wallet or deposit money on our bank account. But here what they are focusing on is basically money that is with the banks and reserves. I think that's the easiest way to think of that one. This is kind of money that the central bank has control over. And the central bank has control over how much cash is being printed, because nobody else is allowed to print. And also the central bank has control over how much electronic money they're creating for banks to hold. Now I have to be a bit careful that I tell you everything that you need to know to understand today's class, but I know that in Econ2021, which you can choose, and in Econ3021, which all of you take, there will be hours spent on this stuff. So I don't want to grab ahead too much, otherwise you get bored in the future. So if I'm too short with my explanations, it's your job, just ask, and I'm happy to give you more information if this is insufficient. Good, so we come back to that graph in a second. We talk a little bit more about the interest rate that we have in there. So we have different central banks. Central banks are basically the institutions that are allowed to print money, and they're in charge of creating money and monetary policy. I think that's the easiest way to think of that one. In Australia, it's the so-called Reserve Bank of Australia. So you see that frequently in the news. People say, oh, interest rate goes up or interest rate goes down. And in Australia, the main policy rate is called the so-called cash rate. and currently that's sitting at 1.5%. The same system we've got in the US. In the US, it's the so-called Fed is the central bank, and the federal funds rate there is 2.5%. And in Europe, it's a little bit trickier. The best equivalent to these interest rates in Europe is the so-called EOINA, Euro Overnight Index Average, and currently that is negative 0.37%. Speaking of presentation topics, I think some groups already said negative interest rates. That's also one of the hot topics because it's a bit unusual. So you're living in very, very special times that interest rates are so low. Usually they're much, much higher, and in the past lots of economists would have put their hand into the fire and say negative interest rates aren't possible. But we do have negative interest rates nowadays. So what do all these interest rates have in common? They are all overnight interbank interest rates. That means you can neither invest at an interest rate nor can you borrow money at that interest rate. This is an interest rate especially between banks if they lend money to each other for one single night, and also I can add to it uncollateralized. So it's a little bit risky. Right? There's no collateral. However, the risk is not high because it's just for one night. So you would hope you know if the other bank is still around tomorrow and can repay you. Everybody on board, so that's important. I should have made lots of exclamation marks here too. Overnight interbank interest rate. That is usually the one that the central banks are targeting and fiddling with. So, how can central banks affect this interest rate? Banks have to hold so-called reserves. Now, what are reserves? The basic idea of reserves is twofold. So, number one is vault cash. Number two, it's money in central bank accounts. So, if you go to an ATM, you would hope the ATM is not empty, right? Because if you go to the bank, to an ATM or to a counter, and you want to withdraw some of your deposits, if you want to get cash out, and they don't have enough cash there, it's a huge problem, right? Number one, you're majorly upset. Number two, you spread the word to other people and they get upset too, even though they might not want to pick up money today, because then if they hear or see in the news that you didn't get money, what would they most likely do? Let's say you get in the news, your local bank didn't pay out its customers today. They were lining up and they didn't have enough cash. What idea might you get? Yes, right. So you start running to the bank and withdraw, and no bank ever has enough cash to pay lots of customers back at the same time. Banks only hold a minimum amount of cash to be able to pay the normal amount of walking in customers. A very simplified and slightly wrong version of that one is to think of it, well, if you put $100 deposits on your bank account, the bank is just putting a little bit of it into the vault, and most of it is lending out to other people. That's the main business of the bank. More advanced, you will learn it's actually working slightly different, but to get the gist out of that one, that's the story, right? So no bank ever has enough cash in the vault to pay out all its customers. That's totally impossible. But they have to have some cash at least. And banks, if a bank pays another bank, so let's say for example I'm with let's say Bank A. I don't want to make advertisement for certain banks. So I'm with Bank A, and I transfer money to you, and you're all with Bank B. Well, somehow that money has to go to Bank B. So Bank B is not giving you additional deposits without getting anything from Bank A. And there's two ways that Bank A now can transfer money over to Bank B. Either they can put all the cash into a truck, drive it over. That of course never happens. The alternative, what they can do is all the banks have an account at the central bank, at the RBA. And what Bank A, my bank, is doing then is transferring from their central bank account towards Bank B's central bank account. So banks pay each other via reserve money, via central bank money. And that's the reason why all banks need central bank money, reserves, and vault cash. Vault to pay out cash, reserve money at the central bank to pay other banks. Very important. And when I talked about the interest rate overnight borrowing beforehand, we are talking about borrowing and lending off this central bank reserve money. Good. Got that one covered. Got that one covered. Cash rate. So the cash rate was in Australia the overnight interest rate between banks, and that's basically the cost if you have too little liquidity on your balance sheet. So if you have too little reserves, then you need to borrow it or get it somehow quick from someone else. And if you borrow it for one night, you have to pay the other bank the cash rate. That's the reason why the cash rate is so important. I did this in very rough sketches. Was that enough to get a rough understanding what reserves and cash requirements are? Good. Nice. And that relates to the demand curve that we have seen here beforehand, right? So let's go back to this one. This is the cash rate now. So if it is very, very expensive to borrow, very, very few banks want to borrow cash. And also, they don't necessarily want to hold lots of reserves and cash on their balance sheet because they can lend it out to someone else. Right? Let's say this is, I'm making a ridiculous example, 10%. So if I could earn 10% by lending my reserves to someone else, of course I do it. Right? And that means I personally don't want to hold that much reserves on my balance sheet. And the opposite is here. If the interest rate is very, very low, let's say 0.2%, right? Then it's not really that much worth lending it out to other banks. I rather keep the reserves with me. So I want to have more reserves on my own account, you might say. And then money demand here is high. Makes sense? Even simpler, think of it as the price of money. If money is expensive, few people want to have money, or few banks want to hold money. If money is cheap, lots of bankers want to hold lots of money. Good. Money supply. Some textbooks have it vertical, some textbooks have it horizontal. I know that in 3210 and in 2200 we do horizontal, and in fact the RBA, even though they might not draw a horizontal line here, is they do have a fixed cash rate target. Currently it's 1.5%. So they don't say we want to have $5 billion in the Australian economy. They say we want to have the cash rate at 1.5%. So it doesn't matter how much money is in the economy. They're currently targeting here 1.5%. That's the reason why we made it horizontal in this class. Good. Nice. So I explained this one. Why is the cash rate important? Well, the cash rate is influencing the loan rate. That's what they have mortgage rates as well. That's what they have in the news all the time too. So if the cash rate is going up, typically mortgage rates go up too. If the cash rate is going down, typically mortgage rates going down too. Now you might think like, why the heck is that, right? The cash rate is one single night between banks. Why should the mortgage rate be affected by this one? And the answer for that one is, there's several answers. A very, very simple answer, which again is too simple, such that it's wrong. They say, well, banks finance themselves via the cash rate, so they borrow money from other banks. They have to pay the cash rate, and if their borrowing cost is increasing with high cash rates, well then they charge their customers more money too. It's a cute explanation. However, if you look at the bank's balance sheet, the amount of borrowing between banks is tiny compared to the size of their balance sheet. So that's not really a good explanation why the mortgage rate is affected by this one. A little bit of a better explanation I find is it's increasing the risk for the banks. So if the cash rate is going up and now my customers are transferring money somewhere else and I'm running low on reserves, I have to borrow reserves quickly and I have to pay the high expensive cash rate. That is of course not nice for me, right? So I don't like that risk. How can I limit that risk? Well, either by having more reserves, but that's potentially costly as well, or I simply don't have that many deposit customers. So I'd simply create less deposits and loans and keep my balance sheet and my bank a little bit smaller. Right? So you can say if the cash rate is very high, banks like to stay a little bit smaller. If the cash rate is very low, banks expand massively. And of course, bank expansion means they hand out more mortgages. And if they hand out more mortgages, what's happening to the interest rate? Down, right? As in anything in economics. So if there's more supply of something, the price of it goes down. If the banks supply more mortgages, the price of mortgages goes down. Again, the details you have in future classes, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. For me, important here now is just that you understand that the cash rate is linked to mortgage rates and loan rates. Also, the cash rate is linked to bond rates. So you talked about bond yields and prices in finance. Just a quick reminder. So if the bond price is going up, what happens to the bond yields? Down, right? You're all on board? Good. So just imagine now, let's say I can earn in the interbank market something ridiculous 10%. So the cash rate is going up to 10%. So it would be very profitable to lend reserves to another bank. But let's say I don't have any reserves right now that I could lend to another bank, but I've got a ton of bonds lying around, and they're currently having a yield of 5%. What could you do? You sell the bonds to some other banks, right? You get reserves in, because the banks pay each other with reserves, and now you lend the reserves to another bank at 10%. The fact that you're selling lots of bonds, and other banks are doing that too, what happens to the bond price? Down, bond yield, up. So you can see the bond yields and the cash rates, they're going in the same direction. They affect each other due to these arbitrage opportunities, right? Because you reshuffle your balance sheet, you reshuffle your investment portfolio such that you're happy with the returns on both. Good. And another one is the yield curve. So we talked about short-term interest rates, but the bonds might be long-term, 10-year bonds. So why the heck would that affect long-term interest rates? Also, when we talk later on about investments, so the whole point we talk about interest rates here is because we want to link it up with our IS curve and our real interest rate. That's the direction we are heading. So somehow we have to link the overnight nominal cash rate to long-term real interest rates. And one way to do that one is the yield curve. Have you done the yield curve in a finance class already? Wonderful, then I can do it very quickly. Have you done all the theories behind it too? Liquidity preference theories and all that stuff? Or even easier. Very good, so I can do it just very quick as a reminder. You really done, like I was just looking in that corner there where people happily were nodding. It's true for everyone? Good. So what do we have here? So this is a yield curve, just a quick reminder. Yield curve means we have here 3-month bonds, 2-year bonds, 5-year bonds, 7-year bonds, 20-year bonds, 30-year bonds. So the duration is getting longer and longer and longer the more we go to the right. And here's the yield, the effective return on that bond. And now I can animate it. And you can see it's jumping around. The main message here out of that one is what you can see here is if the short term is moving, the long term is moving roughly in the same direction. They don't always move one for one, but there's somewhat of a positive correlation here usually, right? So usually if the short-term interest rate here is up, the long-term rate is fairly high too. Now this is very unusual, an inverted yield curve. Now if the interest rates come down, you can see here the short end is being pulled down, and it somewhat pulls the long end down as well. And you've learned in the finance class the different theories why that is the case. The point is all these interest rates are connected. So if the central bank, the RBA, is decreasing the overnight interest rate, it has an impact on the 10-year interest rate as well. They're connected with each other. That's the main point here. So details we do in the other classes. So if you have done finance already, you can be fairly relaxed about that one. And the next one here in red, maybe lots of exclamation marks here too, very important. We assume that in the short run, inflation is sticky. So in the short run, inflation doesn't change very much. Or say it even simpler, prices are somewhat sticky. Right? The prices are not changing much. So if the RBA is pumping more money into the economy tomorrow, or is reducing the cash rate, which is kind of the same thing, it's not that immediately the prices in the shop jump up. So inflation is sticky. And that's important. Because inflation is sticky in the short run, that means that we can keep this one here constant in our mind. Sorry, I just flipped this around. It's a little bit more useful here. So minus inflation on the other side. So this is the interest rate, the nominal interest rate that the central bank can affect on the short run and also for the 10-20-year bond. This is inflation, which is the constant. So feel free to make a dash above it for the time being. And that means if the central bank is raising the nominal interest rate, automatically the real interest rate goes up too in the short run. And the other way around too. Nominal interest rate down, real rate down, because inflation is sticky. It's constant in the short run. Very, very important assumption. We had noticed the difference to what we learned in the long run. In the long run, we said exactly the opposite. Right? In the long run, we said that the real interest rate is constant, and that any change here in the interest rate would affect the inflation rate. Right? So in the long run, the opposite is true. But in the short run, we can keep inflation constant. Good. What else do we have here? How can the RBA affect the cash rate? Again, in 3210, you learn it slightly different, but here we use the simplest version that we can use for this class. We use simple open market operation. Now, have you done open market operations in finance already? No. Good. So what is meant by open market operations? Basically, the RBA buying and selling of bonds. Let's go back into this graph, and we can nice and easily see it. We can also see why people sometimes have a vertical line here. So if the RBA wants the interest rate, the cash rate, to go down from 1.5% to, let's say, 1.25%, how can they do that? If you just look at the graph, if I was going to drop the interest rate down here, what's happening to money supply, to the equivalent amount of money? Gets bigger, right? Now, how can the RBA get more money into the economy? Well, they can just throw it out the window, right? That's so-called helicopter money. Or what's more realistic, open market operation, they go into the market for bonds, and if they want to push money into the economy, they have to buy or sell. Buy bonds, right? Wonderful that somebody had it wrong, because in the exam, people get it wrong frequently. Both students, including myself, because somehow it feels intuitive that you go the other way around. So there's a nice and simple trick that I suggest you should always do in the exam, or always when any kind of these questions come up. And I mentally do it every single time I'm talking about this topic. Did I bring all that? So mentally think bonds, money. And you're the RBA, and now think which way things are going, right? So if you want money into the economy, that means you need to pull bonds out of the economy. If you want to pull money out of the economy, you give bonds into the economy. So if you're selling bonds, you're pulling money out. Make sense? So this is a very, very simple trick that makes it absolutely foolproof. And I know it looks like a kindergarten, but trust me, I've seen plenty of 7 students, so students that get everything right, and on the spot easily mixed up and lost points for something stupid like that. Very easy if you just imagine you have the bonds in your hand, which way to go. Good. So what did I say now? If they're buying lots of bonds, they're pumping money into the market. Also the bond price is going, if the RBA is going into the market, buys lots of bonds, bond price up, bond yield down, right? So it fits nicely with exactly what we're saying here. Bond yield down, interest rates down. Right? So that all works together nicely. Open market operation. Newly created money. So for the RBA, it's very, very easy to create money. Basically, remember that the banks have accounts at the RBA. So what the RBA is simply doing is, if they're buying a bond from a bank, they just type on their computer, okay, $5 million more on their bank account. Done. So the RBA can simply create new reserves in cash. Good, covered. A little bit real data here. So as I said before, you live in very, very special times where interest rate levels and the policy interest rates are exceptionally low. If you look at this, we never had it that low beforehand. So these are not normal times that we have right now. Interest rates used to be much, 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 much higher. Time. Let me do a little bit more and then we have a break. So this is the same story for the S. Currently very, very, very low. In the past, much higher interest rates. Look at this, ridiculously, 18%, right? Remember, this is of course a nominal interest rate. So take a guess at that time, high inflation or low inflation? Very high inflation, right? So the real interest rate wouldn't have been that high, but still most likely fairly high real interest rate at that time too. Good. Wonderful. This is not the summary of the class, don't get too excited, right? So it's just in between for the break. So the central bank can affect the real interest rate because we assume that inflation is sticky. If inflation was fully flexible, this wouldn't work. In the short run, so it's a short run model. Got that one. Inflation is adjusting slowly over time. We have that in the second hour. What do we have up to now? We linked the short-term nominal interest rate with the long-term nominal interest rate. We linked it with the real interest rate because inflation is sticky. And we can say that the central banks can control the short-term nominal, hence also the long-term real interest rate. This is our starting point for what comes next. So we've got here our typical graph with our IS curve that we had before the midterm exam already. And over here is the money market, and in the money market the central bank is active and they can choose. We are choosing a nominal short-term interest rate, the long-term real interest rate here by pushing this yellow line up and down, or you can also say that choose any point on the money demand curve here. So the central banks have pretty much full control what happens to the interest rate here. Good. At least in the simplified model. So what we can do is we can plot that interest rate over here. The way I did it is I said, well, we have positive inflation, so the real interest rate is a little bit lower than the nominal interest rate. But in lots of textbooks, you will see they just draw a straight line through. Same message. The message is whatever happens in the money market is having an impact here on our IS MP diagram. So we call this curve here, it doesn't come across nicely, MP curve. Why is that called MP curve? Basically is money market equilibrium, and we will see in a second it has to do with monetary policy as well. Good, so we've got here a new curve with this equation attached to it. You can see here in that equation there is no GDP gap. So it doesn't matter what the GDP is, the interest rate, the real interest rate is always the same constant. Only if the central bank is changing the nominal rate, then this whole blue line is changing up or down as well. Good. So how do the central bank actually decide the interest rates? And I think I found a nice video there where the RBA governor explains it himself, and he's actually explaining quite a lot of stuff that we talk about in this class. So it's nice to see that it has practical relevance. So I'll let him talk for 4 minutes.
The Reserve Bank's charter was written in 1959. It's broader than the charter of most other central banks. It's got 3 key elements. The Reserve Bank is responsible for low and stable inflation, for full employment, and promoting the general welfare of the Australian people.
Is that loud enough? Good. So did you capture what is the RBA in charge of? What do they try to achieve? Low inflation, right? So you know in this class we don't want to talk about inflation. And what else? Low employment, right? Good. So these are in general welfare, but basically low unemployment, that's what they're after. Not low employment, yes, thank you.
I'm glad we've got this broad mandate. As I said, it's broader than most other central banks. Many other central banks just have a mandate to control inflation. And in the end, low inflation is not the goal in and of itself. It's delivering low inflation to promote the economic prosperity of the Australian people. The Reserve Bank Board sets the cash rate on the first Tuesday of every month. The cash rate is the rate that banks use to lend to one another in the short-term money market. But it has a very large effect on mortgage rates in the economy, on the rates that people get on their savings, and affects asset prices and the exchange rate. So it's a very important interest rate. Sometimes we need to raise interest rates to achieve those objectives. If the economy is growing very strongly, demand's very buoyant, and that's pushing up prices, we might need to raise interest rates.
So try to keep certain things in the back of your mind, because it's all related to what we're doing in the next in this hour. So it's number one, inflation he's looking at, but he also said if the economy is growing very fast, you might want to raise the interest rates as well. And we want to cover that in our model in a second as well.
Slow the economy to get things back onto an even keel. Conversely, if things are weak and demand is not very strong and inflation's low, we might need to lower interest rates to stimulate demand and get inflation back up towards the target. When we change interest rates, people obviously notice it in their mortgages, and that affects how much they spend. When rates are going up, they have less to spend, and when rates are going down, they have more to spend. Changes in the cash rate also affect the exchange rate. If we raise interest rates, the currency tends to appreciate, and when we lower interest rates, the currency tends to depreciate.
So appreciation, depreciation, we do in 2 weeks' time when we talk about the BP curve, also relates to this one.
Changes in interest rates can also affect people's confidence. In some circumstances, lower interest rates makes people feel happier. In other cases, higher interest rates make people feel less happy, and so that affects their spending. Changes in interest rates also affect asset prices. When we have lower interest rates, that tends to push up asset prices. And if asset prices are higher, people might feel wealthier. And if they're wealthier, they might spend more. And conversely, if higher rates might mean lower asset prices, and people don't feel as confident, they don't spend as much. Our board is made up of mainly outside people. They're either business people or people who have experience in other areas of public policy or public service. And I think that's really valuable. What I notice about business people and people who have the broader experience is they're very good at making decisions under uncertainty. And much of what the Reserve Bank Board is doing is making a very important decision in a quite an uncertain world. So we're trading off things all the time, and we're trying to make the best decision in the best welfare of the people of Australia. And the business people and people with outside expertise are very good at doing that. Dare say they're actually better doing it than economists. So I like...
That's of course not correct, right? So don't get the wrong message out of that one.
Kind of having this broad perspective on our board. I think it also helps the legitimacy and the public accountability of the board. It's much better to have interest rate decisions made by this broad group of people rather than primarily made by technical academic economists. So I'm a strong fan of our current board structure, although it's quite different from the boards of most other central banks. At a very practical level, we operate a flexible medium-term inflation target. Our objective is to deliver an average rate of inflation for the community of between 2 and 3% over time.
2 and 3% over time for inflation rate, right? So that's the target. They're not always on target. But let's remember, when we talked about inflation, we said to low and steady inflation, that's their target.
We're prepared to allow the inflation rate to move up and down over time, but we want people to be confident that over time, inflation in Australia will be 2 point something. And if people are confident of that, they can go about making their decisions about saving, investment and spending with assurance that inflation will be low and stable, the value of their money will be protected because it won't be eroded by inflation, and they can have certainty about what the price level will do over time.
Good. So basically what we do now is we back that up with a model. So I'll copy that down from the RBA. I should have written down here RBA2, it's basically from their website. Price stability, low and steady inflation rates, that's what we're after. Price stability doesn't mean zero inflation, but just as he said, 2 point something, right? That's target number one for most central banks in the world. So the ECB has a target similar to that one too. They might not spell it out that loud. And in the US, the Fed as well. And target number two is stabilize the economy. So we don't want to have huge unemployment rates. We don't want to have financial crisis. So that's the second target. He said, well, we're looking at inflation 2 to 3%, but we also look at unemployment. We want that people have jobs. So goal number two of the central bank was we look at the economic activity. And that wasn't in our model beforehand, but we can include it. We can say, well, the central bank is setting the interest rate not only because of inflation, but also because the economy is either running excessively hot, so then the gap is positive, then we're on the right, or the economy is underperforming, we would have high unemployment then, so then the GDP gap would be negative. And you can see here, so if the economy is underperforming, under potential, negative GDP gap, hence the interest rate should go down. And not because of inflation in this moment, simply because the economy is going lower. The central bank would decrease the interest rate. So here they have two goals now. They've got the goal, steady inflation and keeping the economy on track. And these goals can be, of course, sometimes contradictory. So it depends upon if there's more focus on M or more focus on N. Right? So these two variables here are basically saying Are you more of a dove, and doves are looking less at inflation and more at the unemployment number? Or are you more of a hawk? And hawks don't care that much about unemployment, they care much more about inflation. So these two, M, N, are deciding this one. So ceteris paribus, if nothing else changes, they would increase R if the economy is booming. So if this one is big, R gets bigger, and vice versa. Everybody on board with these words? Decided to put a little bit more of specialized words into the class. Ceteris paribus, heard that before? So that means everything else equal, vice versa, and the other way around. So these things you will see often in macro texts or economics all up. Good, Taylor rule. So that is called also the Taylor rule when we add not only inflation into the monetary policy rule, but also GDP, so-called Taylor rule. And that's what we want to try to do now. Now, the Taylor rule is a little bit more tricky than the other one that we had before. Before, we could just draw a straight line here because the central bank is just setting the interest rate depending on inflation, but there's no inflation in this diagram here, right? So it doesn't matter what GDP is, it would be just a straight line. Now, of course, we've got GDP in here, and you've got it on your printouts already, so the slope is positive, right? And the slope is affected by n here. So you can imagine the bigger n, the steeper the slope would be of that new curve. The smaller n, the lower the slope. Extreme curve, if n is 0, then the curve would have exactly a slope of 0, right? Then we would be in the old case that we just said before, and if we send n 0. Good, so now it's an upward sloping curve, and that's changing certain things a little bit, makes also some things a little bit more tricky. The ice curve stays the same. Now, if we change the ice curve, let's say we've got a shock like the export shock that we just said beforehand. Beforehand, we shifted the ice curve to the right, and we just shifted the AD curve to the right, and the interest rates didn't change. Now, of course, if we shift it to the right, something is happening here. And I think I've got that as a U-turn one. Yes, very good. Because in the end, don't stress too much. So this is in gray. That means you don't have to memorize or learn how to derive these things. This is just a proof that I can reshuffle everything to end up with this equation here. Good, but this one is important because it's tricky. So we have an export shock, and now the question is, how do we get to this thing? If you plot a graph with time on one axis and GDP on the other axis, how does it look like? We know already, well, GDP is going to jump up straight away with the exports a little bit. But then the question is, well, will it continue to rise? Will it go straight? Think of the multiplier, right? Because the export companies are receiving money now, so they might spend more money on other people, there's more income, you get the multiplier effect, and so on. But we can also see in the graph something else changes. Interest rate is changing. That might affect investments as well. So scratch your head how you might graph that over time. And I can tell you something else maybe that might be interesting. Let's call this cresting point A. This point here, B. And this point here, C. And scratch your head a little bit through which points the economy might run. And I'll walk around, see how you're going. So the starting point here is we have a positive shock on exports, that's our increase in Chinese exports. In our equation over there on the other side, that would be A. A hat is increasing, right? That's where all the shocks are. And that's an immediate, discrete, strong increase here. And now the multiplier kicks in, right? So because the exports firm have more income, they pay to other people income, and they go more shopping, and so on. Remember that with the C, it goes round and round and round and round, and GDP goes up and up and up and more and more and more. So what we have here is basically, I'll make it like this, a little bit up, and the idea is we've got positive export shock, therefore we've got like the one aggregate demand goes up, and then we had GDP goes up, and because GDP goes up, our consumption goes up, and that goes in a circle depending how strong the multiplier is. So that's a positive one, and that would say that we should keep on increasing here a little bit, right? So that is, we are moving clearly towards the right. So far, so good. But as soon as we are starting moving a little bit to the right, now the central bank kicks in. And the central bank says here, oh, well, if our economy is overheating, they start raising the interest rate. That means we're staying on the blue line. Yes, and I'll get the hang of what I wanted to explain beforehand. So money markets are very, very fast. So basically, we are always on the blue line. We can't be off the blue line. We can be off our ice curve a little bit in between. That is possible, but we can't be off our blue line. So now, as soon as we're going a little bit to the right, now the interest rates are going to increase a bit. So that's basically coming from here with our Taylor rule now. Because of this one, the central bank is increasing the interest rate. And that is, of course, causing investment to come down and GDP to come down a little bit. And then the question is, which of the two impacts here is stronger? Right? Now, if this impact would be stronger than that one, and that relates to now I'm clicking a little bit better, then we would starting to go backwards again. Then they would start decreasing the interest rate here again. Right? So we have to take these two impacts here together. And if you look at the graph here, at that interest rate, we are not finished with our positive growth, right? We are still going towards the ice curve here. So we're still moving towards the right, and the interest rate keep on going higher and higher and higher. That basically means that our top loop here, the positive loop, is a little bit stronger than the negative loop that we have here. Otherwise, we wouldn't go further to the right and get higher and higher interest rates. Right? If this loop was too weak, we would start going towards the left early on again, and then the central bank would start decreasing the interest rate again. Makes sense? And that's the reason why the economy here, initially positive shock, then due to the multiplier we are growing. But let's make two different graphs. So usually the multiplier would look like this, tapering out. But now because the interest rate is increasing, the impact is weaker. Makes sense? So also the economy is not going as high as if the central bank was not reacting. Remember, if the central bank is not reacting, we would just be standing here on the horizontal line, and we would reach this top GDP here, much, much higher GDP. But because now the central bank is reacting, increasing the interest rate, we are dampening the whole system here a little bit, and we don't get as high up anymore. Because the interest rates are higher, and we call that also, if the interest rates are higher, and therefore one part of the economy is shrinking while the other one is still increasing, it's called, if the room is very full, we are crowding out some people, so it's crowding out. Right? In this case here, crowding out by the central bank. Usually we crowd out by other reasons, but that's easy enough. So watch out, some textbooks actually do it, A, B, C. But I feel very strong that doesn't fly, because we never reach that point B here. We would reach point B only if the interest rate would have not been changed. But it's very, very unlikely that the central bank is waiting that long and changes the interest rate only at the very end and then crashes the economy into recession.
What about central banks make decisions on a monthly basis to ensure that
Very good point. So central banks, remember, one of their main points is that they're targeting inflation and also the economy. But month on month, how much does the economy change? Hardly any, right? Same thing with sticky inflation. However, there are special times where the economy does change month on month. And what does the central bank then do? Do they wait till next Tuesday? Nah, right? So if there's a big earthquake in the US, in New York, the stock exchange crashes, there's a catastrophe there, be assured the central bankers are meeting within hours, right? Same thing when they had GFC, they just meet all the time. So they usually have, if everything is normal, the Tuesday meeting and announcement. But if something really is demanding their attention, they're not saying it's not Tuesday yet, right? They're meeting. That will work. So today we introduced the central bank to our model. We did so by assuming that inflation is pretty sticky, so any change in the nominal interest rate was affecting the real interest rate. The real interest rate was, of course, important with the IS curve, with the investment decision of real companies. So this is depicted by the IS curve. Now we introduce the MP curve, which is depicting the central bank behavior and central bank reactions. In math terms, this is shown by the Taylor rule, which includes the central bank's reaction to inflation, which we'll talk about more in the future, and the central bank reactions to current GDP gap.